Our mission. Helping Parents Heal is a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting bereaved parents to become shining light parents by providing support and resources to aid in the healing process. We go a step beyond other groups by allowing the open discussion of spiritual experiences and evidence for the afterlife in a non-dogmatic way. Affiliate groups welcome everyone, regardless of religious or non-religious background. Attendance today at this meeting is voluntary, and we are here for the benefit of learning from and sharing with other parents whose child has passed away. It is understood that our discussions are intended to be confidential and not designed to replace traditional therapy or spiritual counseling. However, these Zoom meetings are very helpful to parents all around the world, and they are posted on YouTube so that affiliate members who are not able to attend this live meeting can also watch. Helping Parents Heal offers a wide variety of speakers to allow parents to be informed about many possible ways to heal, to connect with their children, and to learn about the afterlife. The views expressed by our guests do not necessarily reflect those of Helping Parents Heal, and we ask that you take from their presentations whatever may benefit you personally. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, David. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm so glad to be with everyone.
We are so grateful. And I just want to do a short introduction. I know everybody wants to hear you start speaking right away. I also want to just remind people to put where they're from, if they're affiliate leaders, caring listeners, or on the board in the chat box so that we can recognize you as well. But let me go ahead and just, it's very short. David Kessler is one of the world's foremost experts on grief and loss. David's personal experience as a child witnessing a mass shooting while his mother was dying in a hospital shaped his career and passion for healing. He is the author of 5 best-selling books, including You Can Heal Your Heart with Louise Hay. He co-authored 2 bestsellers with the legendary Elisabeth Kübler-Ross on grief and grieving and life lessons. His first book, The Needs of the Dying, is a #1 best-selling hospice book and received praise by Mother Teresa. His newest book from Simon & Schuster is called Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief. David is the founder of grief.com, an invaluable resource to millions who are grieving. He's also, as I said, a shining light parent and kindly spoke to Helping Parents Heal by Zoom in April of this year. You can find out more about David at his website, www.davidkessler.org. And also, if you are not part of his Facebook site, it's such a treat to be able to hear him speak for an hour almost every evening. And sometimes he has guests, sometimes he speaks himself. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Kessler.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here with you. So we should have went over that earlier. Let me give you a couple of corrections. The best place for anyone to find me is grief.com. Just so you know, that's the best website. The group is still there. It's once a week we're on now live. And I have another group, Tender Hearts, which is causing, some of you are in the group actually, causing a dilemma for some people because someone's filling in for me tonight in that group so I could be with you. And my group's like, where do I go? I'm in Helping Parents Heal and I'm in Tender Hearts. So I said, just go wherever you feel moved to. So for those of you who are in both groups, it's nice to see you here also. Well, I'm so glad to be with you. It's such a strange time in the world, and I think it's such a strange time in our lives, and to be dealing with so much loss personally and collectively in the world. So as was mentioned, I started out with my own mother dying, and at the same time there being a mass shooting that I was involved in. And so I saw a lot of death early in my life, and it changed my trajectory, which led me to becoming a grief specialist. As was mentioned, I spent 40 years doing that. And I wouldn't say I thought I knew everything about grief. I wouldn't have said that. But I will say when my own son died, younger son died 4 years ago, David, I was thrown back into the epicenter of it. And it made me want to write a note to every parent I had ever counseled saying, I didn't realize how bad the pain was. So it was interesting to have that deep loss at that time in my life in a grief career. I had to really decide if I was going to listen to all the things I've been telling everyone to do over the years. And I forced myself to go to a grief counselor. And I forced myself to sit in bereavement groups for parents with glasses on, without my contacts, with a cap, 4 seats away from a table with my books on them, not telling anyone that's me, but sitting there trying to be not the grief specialist, but the father who had to bury a child. So because of that, I'm telling you, when anyone shows up, virtually anyway, I just want to applaud you that you're showing up to help yourself and honor your child that died, because I think it does honor them. And if their life was precious, so is ours. And that's a lot of my work. So I want to just sort of talk a little bit for a while, and then I'd love to really get your questions and have a dialogue, because I'd rather we talk together than me talk at you. But let me just give you a little information. It's interesting. I obviously worked for decades with Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. I just had Ken Ross, her son, in my Tender Hearts group. And at some point, I'm going to take that recording and put it on my Facebook. And any of you that want to follow me and see that recording when it comes out, you can find me at facebook.com/I am David Kessler. By the time I got to Facebook, David Kessler was already taken. So I had to be facebook.com/I am David Kessler. So you can always find that through grief.com too. But I would say to Elisabeth, who became very famous, obviously, for her work in starting hospice, in bringing dying out of the darkness and into the light in the 60s. I think we forget back in the 60s, the same way Betty Ford brought addiction to the light. And Michael Landon and so many other people talked about their cancer and brought that to the light. We didn't talk about death. We didn't talk about death. And Elisabeth, broke so many barriers to do that. In her classic book on death and dying, she mentioned 5 words: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, that in the marketing world, you're always looking to simplify things. And those words took off. And Elisabeth was a woman who had literally written so many books, I think like 26 books in 41 languages, did thousands of lectures. And people wanted to reduce her to 5 words. And I would always sit with her over the years and I would go, Elisabeth, people are adopting those stages for grief. She goes, I wrote about them for dying. I went, I understand, but they're adopting them for grief. And very poorly, I might add. And that was like an ongoing dialogue we would have. And finally, she called me and said, all right, let's adopt them for grief and let's do a book. And this is the book we ended up doing on grief and grieving. One of the big criticisms you hear about the stages is they weren't ever adopted for grief. Yes, they were. I have a whole book to prove it. Interestingly enough, on page 1 of the book, on page 1, we reminded people the stages are not linear. They're overlapping. You don't have to follow them. There's no right way to do grief. There's no one model. And Elisabeth had all said that in her first book on death and dying. But I think the media got those 5 stages and really wanted to reduce them to 5 easy steps for grief. Elisabeth also was a well-known rule breaker. She was a messy rule-breaking person. And it's interesting because people will sometimes say on Facebook or Instagram, oh, you and Elisabeth Kübler-Ross are just trying to neaten up our grief and make us follow your rules. And I'm like, oh my goodness, they did not know Elisabeth. I can remember there was one time Elisabeth was in the hospital. And when she was in the hospital, my kids were probably 9 and 10, maybe 10 and 11, somewhere in that age range. And we went to visit her, and my kids stayed in the lobby because I forgot what you had to be, whatever it was, 13 or 14. And I went up to see Elisabeth, and she said, where are the kids? And I went, they're downstairs, you know, the rule, you have to be 13 or 14. And she was like, I'm so disappointed in you. Have I taught you nothing? Can you not even break that rule and find a way to sneak them up here? And I'm like, oh, okay, Elisabeth. She would always tease me about, I color in the box. So when people talk, and I got the kids up to her, but when people talk about the stages or rules we have to follow, no one would hate that concept more than Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. She would hate that concept. So I always like to clear that up front, and just give you a little information on her. And like I said, I will make that talk that her and her son and I did public because I think it's an important talk. So after my own son David died, I canceled everything. I was in grief, just like everyone goes through it. And it was brutal, and it's still brutal. And I observed myself. Sometimes as the grief expert, I would go, oh yeah, you're in anger. Oh yeah, you're in denial. You can't believe it happened. All those things. Oh yeah, the stages were overlapping. Oh, you know, and I was also curious, have I been telling people stuff all these years? Is it really true? Is it going to work for me? And luckily, like I said, I had to force myself to do what I tell other people to do. And one of the things, there came a point when I had to begin to wrestle with this idea of acceptance. And when I thought in my mind about, I'm going to have to accept this, I thought about a few things that Elisabeth and I had often talked about. Number one, there's not one big acceptance. There's a little small acceptance we have to go through just to plan the funeral. There's another acceptance we have to go through just to show up at the funeral. It's not like, oh, there's one acceptance and it was in the top drawer, I forgot to look there, right? It's like many, probably hundreds of rounds with acceptance we do. And as I began to wrestle with the idea of like, how am I going to accept my son's death? Elisabeth and I had often been so upset also how this stage of acceptance took on a finality that we never intended it to have. It's not the end, it's not the last stage. So it was an interesting thing to be wrestling with that. And I knew for me, there was no way I could stop at acceptance. I was like, is that it? I'm just going to accept David's dead? Is that all? Couldn't do that. One night at this very desk where I'm sitting, I was going through some papers. I'm sitting at home in my pain. Lectures have been canceled. I find these papers I wrote on meaning. And I looked at them and I went, meaning and grief, like that's going to help. And I threw them down. Then about a couple of weeks later, I picked it back up and I started reading. And meaning didn't take away my pain, but it gave me a little cushion. And I really felt like that's where I want to go from acceptance. I want to be able to find meaning. I want to be able to find a way to mark David's death, but really honor his life. And to have it change me, because it did change my soul so deeply. And as I began talking about this, and I talked to so many people who had so many different losses and how they were finding meaning, people kept going, that's the sixth stage. And I would go, remember, we're not doing the stages. And they would go, that's the sixth stage. So I thought, I don't know if that's meant to be. I called up the Kübler-Ross family at one point and I said, I'm thinking of doing this book, and people keep saying it's the sixth stage. And, Ken and I talked about, his mother had talked about meaning. His mother had talked about hope and all those things being other stages. I mean, if you look in Death and Dying, I think there's like 7 stages actually. But we talked about that, and they gave me permission to write Finding Meaning, the 6th stage of grief, which is the newest book here. And I was so honored that they allowed me to do it. And it was one more chance also for me to go back and clear up some of those myths for younger readers about the stages aren't linear, they're not a model, all that. So it was a fascinating thing for me to really share those things about meaning. So let me talk to you a bit about them. First of all, as I mentioned, the stages don't prescribe, they describe, and they only describe a general process. And certainly in adding a 6th stage, I'm not adding any mandatory stop in the grieving thing, in the grieving world. It's interesting, when people say to me, how long will I grieve? Or how long is my wife or my husband or my sister or my loved one going to grieve? My answer is always, well, how long is the person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead for a long time, you're going to grieve for a long time. But it doesn't mean we will always grieve with pain. To me, the goal of grief work is to help people grieve with more love than pain, in their own way, at their own pace, in their own time. And when we talk about meaning, we're really talking about the concept of post-traumatic growth. We hear so much about post-traumatic stress. Most people in horrible tragedies have the ability to come out the other side, not forgetting their loss or getting over their loss or getting past their loss or moving on, but moving forward with that growth, and that growth that honors our loved one. I do a lot of trauma work, and people get so stuck in their trauma and the traumatic moment. And I'm a big believer that in grief work, we have to go back to that traumatic moment and take you out of it, and not acknowledge the trauma and grief you're in, but not leave you stuck in the traumatic moment. And one of the things I'm really big on that a lot of people don't see that way, but I do, is we have to bring our loved ones out of the traumatic moment with us. I believe we move forward in life with our loved ones. I never leave the dead behind. So I think that's such an important concept to really think about. When we think about what is meaning, meaning is a changed identity. It's a changed relationship with others. It's a changed outlook on life. I think one of the confusing things, people have looked at the book and said, oh, I'm not ready for meaning, I'm in too much pain. Most of the book is about excavating the pain to get to the meaning. And it's not a shortcut. There is no shortcut. It really is giving people tools to help with the pain. One of the things I researched in the book, which was, never thought I'd be researching it, was buffaloes. Buffaloes, when they sense a storm coming, they actually run towards the storm. They run towards the storm, thereby minimizing the time they are in the discomfort. In our modern world, people want us to ignore the storm, ignore the dark night, ignore the grief, ignore the pain, and therefore maximizing how long we're in the pain. So in many ways, we're a grief illiterate world, and I'm trying to help people find tools to help with that grief. What does meaning look like? It can be finding gratitude for the time you had with a loved one. It can be finding a way to commemorate them. It can be realizing the brevity of life and the value. It can be feeling changed by their own life and your life. It can be feeling changed by their death. Maybe you want to make the world a better place so other people don't die the way they did. Maybe it's creating meaning for others. Let me read you a few guidelines from the book. Don't worry, I know it's scary when an author picks up their own book, but it's just a few things I'm going to read you that I think might be helpful. These are some thoughts that may guide you in your understanding of meaning, and it's 7 thoughts. 1, meaning is relative and personal. No one can find it but you. 2, meaning takes time. You may not find it for months or even years after a loss. 3, meaning doesn't require understanding. It isn't necessary to understand why someone died in order to find meaning. Some of us are never going to find a satisfying why, but we can still find meaning. And 5, even when you do find meaning, it won't be worth the cost of your loved one who died. I don't care how much meaning, I'd always rather have my son back. And 5, this is a really big one in our modern world. Your loss is not a test, a lesson, something to handle, a gift, or a blessing. Loss is what happens in life. Meaning is what we make happen afterwards. And 6, only you can find your own meaning. And 7, meaningful connections can heal painful memories. So I just like to sort of point those out for people to sort of really understand what I'm talking about. The other thing I want people to know is the meaning is in us. Some people go, there's no meaning in a horrible death. There's no meaning in COVID. There's no meaning in a death by suicide or a death by cancer or a horrible accident or an overdose. And I'll go, of course there's not. Meaning's not in the horrific death. It's not in a murder. Meaning is in us afterwards. It's what we do. So when I think of the goals of grief work, I think of 2. We have to figure out who we are without our loved one being physically here. And the second goal is we have to establish a new relationship with them. We knew how to love them when they were physically here. We need to learn how to love them in their absence. You know, it's interesting in psychology, decades ago, there was almost this thought that you're supposed to sever and end and complete the relationship with your loved one who died. And I wrote a whole chapter in the new book on continued connections and how we know psychologically it's healthy to have a continued relationship with your loved one who died. That's an important part of the grief experience. You know, became very well known in the grief world, but like Kübler-Ross, she wanted me to know death and grief. And my work for decades was in the hospital and hospice setting and palliative care and ICUs with people whose loved one was dying. And sometimes when I would go into the room and talk to the family, I maybe would see the person sleeping and I'd ask the family to come out. And I would say to them, when you go in your loved one's room who's dying and they're sleeping, what do you do? And they go, kind of just watch them sleep. And I said, are you willing to do an experiment? And they'd go, what? And I go, the next time you walk into the room and they're sleeping, I want you to turn the chair with your back towards them and sit with them without being able to see them. And people will go, what are you talking about? Why would you have us do that? And I said, because we have a relationship that relies on the physical. I think you're here when I see you. We don't know how to have a relationship that doesn't rely on the physical. So sit there with your back to your loved one. Learn how to feel them, to feel their emotions, to connect with them spiritually, to not rely on the physical, because the day will come soon when you will no longer have the physical. But don't give death any more power than it already has. Death has the power to end a physical life. but it doesn't have the power to end a relationship. It doesn't have the power to end our love. So don't give it that kind of power. Another thing I like to let people know, obviously there's no timeline in grief, but there are certain milestones that I think people don't really understand until, like, all of you are grief experts. You could teach this too. There's what we call anticipatory grief, which is the grief we might feel ahead of time when our loved one has a terminal illness, or we're like, oh my gosh, they could die from this mental illness, they could die from this addiction, whatever it may be. And we have the anticipatory grief. Then when someone dies, we go into what I call acute grief. And acute grief is that it just happened. They talk about usually the range is anywhere from 1 week to 6 to 9 months. I think when you're a bereaved parent, the acute phase is much longer. It's just when you're in it, it's just happened in your life. And when you come out of the acute phase, people will say things like, I'm just beginning to feel my feet on the ground again. I'm just beginning to catch my breath. And then they go into what I call early grief. Now, if you went down to the local mall or to the local street and said to people, when's early grief? Most people would go, I don't know, the first week, the first month. I think early grief is the first 2 years. And I think for a bereaved parent, it may even be longer. Then from there, and this is different for everyone. This is all general stuff. Our grief is as individual as our fingerprint. Then we go into mature grief, but we still grieve for the rest of our lives. I am never going to stop missing my son. I'm never forgetting my son. The other thing I also want people to know is I think there's this image that our work is to make our grief smaller. I don't think your grief gets smaller. I think we have to become bigger. I think we grow around our grief. So I think that's a really important concept that we often don't think about when we deal with grief, or when people on the outer world think about us and dealing with grief and loss. So that's kind of the gist of what I wanted to say to you tonight. I really want to make sure, like I said, we have lots of time for dialogue and questions, because I think that's where almost the most interesting part of this is. So I'm curious to see what people want to talk about here, say, do.
Well, there's so many things that are written in the chat box already. There are lots of questions. A lot of them are confidential, so I'll be asking them without necessarily giving names.
Sure.
But I also want to just say, Anna is saying, I totally agree with him. To experience every single word he is saying, this is something that she's already been through. Sandra is saying, this is my favorite book. It encompasses deeper understanding and tools to grow with whatever you have left. Gordine is saying, I totally agree with him too, especially running into the storm and taking ourselves out of the trauma, which I think is beautiful about the bison. Dolores is saying, yes, we can still love them in their physical absence and they still love us. Gordine again is saying,
And let me just say one thing about that. It's rare that I try professionally to never disagree with any other grief specialist or grief quote, but there is a really well-known quote out there that people talk about that, like, grief is love with nowhere to go. I got to tell you, I love my son every day. My grief knows where to go. It goes to my son. I miss him. I send him love every day. I have never stopped that experience, nor will I let myself stop that experience.
That's beautiful. And of course, that's true. I agree with you. I don't like that quote at all, because we know exactly where our love is going. But Galen is saying, I just want to thank David for speaking tonight. I am a huge fan and grew exponentially because of his work. I especially loved the interview with Brent Brown. Thank you.
Oh, Brene Brown. Yes, that's great.
Oh, Brene. She put, okay, Brene Brown. Goodness gracious.
Right, Brene Brown.
Yes.
Like, literally, and that's like coming back up the charts again. That was like #1 in the world. the #1 podcast. It's really wonderful. In fact, I'll put it in the chat in case anyone hasn't heard it.
That would be wonderful. Sally's saying, I love this. Sally's fairly new to the group. Dolores is saying, yes, without the physical, they're with us. Sherry's saying, wonderful, I love this. And Iris is saying, I love his words. That's so beautiful. He gets it, etc. I want to get to the questions, though, if possible. First of all, the first question is when you're taking questions, she'd love to hear tips on coming to terms with a child who's passed by suicide, the shame, and how we separate it from our identity as a parent. Is that something that you could maybe address for us?
Of course. So, and first of all, we don't have time to really get into it, but I do have a whole 3-part series for anyone who wants to know sort of all my thoughts on that. Not all, but a lot more. And you can find that. It's completely free. It's 3 parts. You get 1 a week. And it's at suicidegrief.com. Suicidegrief.com is where you would find that. So it's completely free. So a few things. The world has changed. Most of us grew up in a world where we were taught suicide is a selfish thing to do. It's a choice people make. It's a short-term solution to a long-term solution to a short-term problem. All those things we're seeing medically, evidentially, are wrong. Death by suicide is the outcome of a mind that has become ill and has become compromised. Our loved ones didn't choose it. They didn't want it. They were trying to figure out how to manage their pain. That's the reality. The world doesn't get that yet. We're trying to. Like I said, my biggest audience is therapists. I'm training them all the time to understand that. We have a lot of religious beliefs that clash with that. I come from a family that's a mixture of Judaism and evangelical Christianity. So I deal with a lot of these concepts and professionally and practically and personally, but it's a challenging thing. And to really understand that when we're talking about our loved one being mentally compromised, or we're talking about addiction, and a lot of times both. I always remember the 3 C's. We didn't cause it, we couldn't control it, and we couldn't cure it. And if love could have saved your loved one from death by suicide, it would have. And you're going to hear noise out there. What people think of you and your grief is none of your business. Easier said than done. I completely get that. But don't buy into it. And we got to release that stigma. There's also a really great piece that I did with Larry King that I talked about that too, that if you have a chance, it's on my Facebook page to go and take a look at that too.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I know that this is going to help so many parents who are on here. We have another question that's kind of confidential. As a mom, I honor my son's life. But as the years pass, it seems his friends and our family avoid speaking his name. It makes others uncomfortable, yet it's what I feel is necessary to keep his memories alive. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's why I always tell everyone, all of you are the grief experts. You really are. You have been through this. And we're in a grief illiterate world that doesn't know how to handle it. You have to be the one to say their name without apology. You have to be the one to talk about them without apology. That's the reality of it. And it's really hard to do. But we have to be the one to sometimes say, you know, gosh, I'm really glad to see all of you. It really makes me miss David, to realize how we're all so hurting. And then someone will go, oh, you know, don't be sad. And I go, oh, I wish you saying it could stop that. But sadness is a part of the love. So I'm going to have that. That's just what grief looks like. And to sort of own that.
That's beautiful. And I think that one of the things that really helps all of us is to have a space that's safe that you have created,
Right.
to also have this group where parents can talk about their kids all the time. And we love hearing about the kids because they're all, I feel kind of like they're all my kids. But
Right. And like in my group, Tender Hearts, the private group that's off Facebook that works with me every day, we literally have in our town square, we have a photo park. And the photo park is where we can post our pictures, a million if we want, on their birthdays when we're thinking about them, without apology, without someone on Facebook going, oh, that's so depressing.
well, and we have a tribute section as well for helping
Good,
parents
good. That's
heal, and
so
we
good.
post them every single day on their angel dates and on their birthdays. Darcy is saying, I lost my dad, then my son and best friend very tragically. How do we separate each loss and grieve each one individually?
All right, I'll tell you this psychologically, then I'll also tell it to you spiritually. With multiple losses, psychologically, sometimes it's helpful to compartmentalize. Like wonderful, my friend on here, Dolores, is on. Dolores has been to my retreat. She's been in a speaker in my Tender Hearts and in the writing group. And one of the things is sometimes I'll have people back in the physical world at the retreats write a letter to their loved one. And people go, oh, I've had multiple losses. I don't know who to write to. And I'll go, you have to pick one. I can choose for you. Oh, if I picked it, the other ones will get mad. No, you can write one tomorrow to the other ones and one tomorrow to the next day. Here's the key. You cannot grieve multiple losses. You can only grieve individual people. So if I have so many multiple losses and them bombarding me and my mind goes to, there's so many losses, I can't grieve them. I will sometimes have people artificially separate them. I'll say once a week, make Tuesday night the day for your child. Eat their favorite foods, watch their favorite movie, do something you loved with them. Then maybe Saturday for an hour. Your dad died, do something you loved with him. Listen to his music or do a favorite activity that you two would do, because each grief deserves its own time and its own due. So we want to make sure we do that. Now, the other thing is our minds can work against us. We judge our grief. Here's what happened to me. It's so weird. This has been happening a lot. I'll tell you two things that happened. One, I have my father's watch that I just saw on his arm growing up. And it's an antique watch now. It wasn't an antique when he bought it. It was just a watch, but it's an old Hamilton watch. And one day, it's so strange. I was like, it's like his watch was lighting up and I went, oh, I'm just going to put it on. Just going to wear it. It just came to me to wear it. So I put the watch on. I didn't go, oh no, I'm being disloyal to my son, David. Why on earth would I think about my father when my son is dead? I let the grief lead me. I don't lead my grief. If one day I feel my father connecting, I go with my father. If another day, and obviously there's a lot of more days, it's my son, I go with my son. If my mother comes up in my mind, I go with that. Let the grief lead you. Don't feel like anytime you grieve one, you're being disloyal to another. That's not the way grief works. It's also fascinating with my father. Just the other day, my mother died so young. I could tell you the day she died. I mean, I'm like on top of that. She was ripped away from me. My father lived till he was in his 80s. He had a long life. He died in my place. It was a beautiful death. You know, I got enough of him. He had such a good life. And the other day, I if you know me, people who know me well, you've seen me in a hat like 0 times. One day I got up and I'm like, I grabbed a hat, like I got 2 hats. I put a hat on and I looked in the mirror and I went, wow, I look just like my dad now that I'm older and getting to be, up in years. And I thought, I'm going to wear this for a while. And I thought, gosh, it's so weird. My dad is coming to me. And then I looked at the calendar. It was the anniversary of his death.
Oh,
So it's amazing how, like, just listen, connect with your grief, let it lead you, connect with them.
that's absolutely beautiful. Irene is asking, can you talk more about moving into the love that you described in your latest book, please?
Sure, it really is. You have to go through the pain. You can't heal what you don't feel. Sometimes we want to get to the light quicker. And here's what we don't realize that's important. And this is why it's important to work with someone in a group with peers. What sometimes we do, we don't realize is when we say, why am I still in so much pain? Why am I crying all the time? Why aren't I finding the meaning? Why aren't I getting to the light? I'm subtly judging my grief as wrong. I'm suddenly judging myself as going, I should be further. And when you judge grief, you suppress it and complicate it. And grief has to be able to breathe. And if you've got 1,000 tears to cry, or in grief, sometimes it's 10,000 or 100,000, it feels like, you can't stop at 300. You got to cry them all. And you'll get to the meaning when you're done.
That's beautiful. Well, we have a caring listener. We have actually caring listeners who speak 9 different languages, and we have one who's on here tonight, Mabel, who is asking, as a caring listener, if any of your books are translated into Chinese, because she thinks that every grieving parent needs to listen to you and to read your books.
Most of them are translated into tons of languages, Spanish, Chinese. So lots of them are translated. Okay. The new one I know for sure is getting translated into Spanish right now, and it's already in Chinese.
And it's already in Chinese. That's wonderful news. Well, we do have Helping Parents Heal on Espanol, and our affiliate leader is here on with us this evening. And so I'm sure she'll be very excited about that as well. Do you speak Spanish?
Very little. Poquito.
She's been having some wonderful Spanish-speaking grief specialists on her group. So I was just asking that.
If she's got a translator, I'll go on with her. An interpreter.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. She's actually an interpreter by trade. So she lives in Philadelphia. She's from Lima, Peru. So you may be having her call you sometime very soon.
I was so honored when I worked in the hospital world. One of the groups that I was manager of was our interpreters. So they're really so incredible.
Well, that's very, very exciting to hear that. Heidi is saying, you mentioned bringing our loved ones out of the trauma. I love that idea. Can you elaborate with examples of how we might do that?
It's challenging to do it in a few words. It's a lot of the work I do with people, but it's, so many times we get stuck in the traumatic moment. I think of 3 things. There's the grief, there's the trauma, there's the traumatic moment. The traumatic moment is the call, you saw them, how they looked, how they were killed, when they died, all that traumatic moment. So there's the grief, the trauma, the traumatic moment. All grief does not have trauma, but all trauma has grief. You cannot do trauma work without doing grief work. And a lot of times we get stuck in the moment, post-traumatic stress. We don't remember what happened. We re-feel what happened. We re-feel it and we relive it. So a lot of times when clinicians work with people to get them out of the traumatic moment and get them out of their post-traumatic stress, and into the present, I'll be like, great, you're in the present, but where are your loved ones? They're still there? No, no, no. In our work, we've got to bring them with us. We don't want them to live in the post-traumatic stress either and be stuck in the moment. So that's a big thing I try to work with people on.
Well,
Like I said, that's explaining it. I can't, obviously I would need more time to do it with someone.
well, it's a good start. And there's a Zoom user who's asking, I believe that we grow or must grow bigger in our grief. And I'm working very hard to do so. My son, who was 16, passed. His name is Jack, in a car accident in June. I know I am getting stronger and better because of him, but I regret I was not bigger when he was here. How do you suggest we cope with this, that sense of not being our best and biggest selves when our kids were here?
First of all, if you are a parent, you are imperfect. I am just sorry to tell you that. We are all imperfect parents. We look at Facebook and Hallmark cards and paintings and we think everyone's perfect parent but me. And the reality is we're all imperfect parents. We all make mistakes. And I got to tell you, making mistakes and imperfect parenting is not only part of the human experience, but if we were perfect parents, it wouldn't be good for our children either. The other thing is subconsciously, it's hard to have a child die and not on a subconscious level go, gosh, I didn't do that well, did I? You know, a friend of mine, it brought me to tears the other day. She started to ask me for parenting advice. And I said to her, you know, one of my kids died. You're asking me for parenting advice? And she goes, you were an amazing parent. I would take advice from you any day. And it brought me to tears and it made me realize how subtly I judge myself as somehow inadequate because I had a child die. So it's a very subtle thing, and part of our work has to be to remind one another. None of us are perfect. And those imperfections did not cause our child's death. I do a lot of work and I talk in the new book a lot about brain science. We think in brain science, we don't realize how our mind works against us and takes some of its protective mechanisms and turns them on us to protect us, but it ends up blaming us. So we need to do work unraveling that.
That's such great advice. And I have another question about how to handle grief with our living children and making their grief their own and not ours. Is there any advice about that?
Absolutely, I live that. So I'll tell you a quick story about that. My sons are 1 year apart. So my older son was just a year older, was 22, when my younger son, his brother, died. A few years later, I have to live with, I can't be the grief expert for my own son. So one day my son said to me, hey, my older son obviously said, hey, you're doing a lecture. I was doing a lecture in LA. It was about 300 people. He goes, can my girlfriend and I come to your lecture? And I went, I'm going to show you the inside and outside of me. The outside of me went, sure, I'll put your name on the list. Okay, see you there. Inside, I was like, yes, he's coming. I'm going to design a lecture just for him. I'm going to tell him everything I've wanted him to know about grief. But then I had to sit with, I cannot do that. He'll feel it's a lie. I have to give the lecture I was planning to give to the audience, and he'll hear what he needs to hear. So I do the talk. After the talk, he comes up to me and he says, hey, that was good. You know, when you were giving the Q&A after the questions, he said, could I have asked you a question? And I went, well, yeah. And he goes, I didn't know, like, publicly if you would have been okay with that. And I went, of course you could have publicly asked me a question. By the way, I'm your dad. You can ask me anything, anytime. What's your question? And he goes, I'll wait for the next lecture. I'm like, what?
Oh.
Ask me now. And he goes, no, I'll wait for the next lecture. I had to force myself to give my older son the dignity of asking his question when and where he wanted, and to know I might not be the one that ultimately answers it. And people are like, did he ever ask you? He's never asked me.
Oh.
Drives me crazy. But, it's not my place. And I also think what we do, and I noticed this, when I would see my older son, every time my older son comes over, I could talk to him about his brother day and night. That's all I could do. I had to realize if I do that, he's not going to come here. That I can't be the grieving dad for him. And I had to be able to really figure out a way when I said, how are you doing today? To really be asking him, to not be going, how are you? How are you doing? Because I would ask him and then go into my own wound and my own trauma. And I can't be there for him. And one of the tricks I found is I would go to my son's grave before he came over. So I would really get in touch with my own grief. So by the time he came over, I could be there for him. Challenging stuff.
That's beautiful, though. And just being able to see you moving forward and healing and having him understand that you are able to move forward. I think that that's one of the hard things for our kids, is that they feel like they have to heal us first before they can start to heal. And I think that being able to see you doing all the work that you're doing for all of these families is so helpful to him. And I'm sure that if he never does ask that question of you, he's going to hear your answer in one of the many talks that you give, which is wonderful.
Maybe so, but maybe he'll get it from a friend. I'm not his source.
Yes.
I'm not his source at the end of the day, Maybe he'll get it from his brother.
Well,
Who
you're
knows?
right. It might be directly from his brother, which would be very beautiful as well. There's a question that I'd love to ask about the what if and even if. It was very helpful for this mom, Colleen, to process the pain. Could you just maybe touch on that for us?
Sure. It goes back to brain science work that I do a lot of work on, and how we process grief. How haunted we are by two little words. Two little words can destroy the rest of our life. What if? What if I had gotten there 10 minutes early? I had the doctor double check them. Whatever it is, I didn't go to lunch. I showed up 10 minutes early, whatever. I work with people and explain to them and walk them through how brain science works, and really use scientific theory to understand how the mind is creating that. And techniques I use is that I really teach them about confabulation, how our mind can believe a lie, and how with mirroring neurons and neural pathways and neurons that fire together, wire together, we can believe these lies from our mind that's trying to protect them. Our mind does things that say what happens before the death caused the death. Oh, you had an argument, you had a phone call, you didn't have a phone call, you should have said some. All those what ifs that happen. I find that like 99% of the what ifs didn't cause the death, but our mind makes us think that. So I walk people through a process, and it's in the book, and I do it in my group, where we write down all the what ifs, and then we really check them out scientifically and question them and look at them. And by the way, when you're early in grief, you get to ask those questions. You get to have magical thinking. You get to say, what if I didn't go to lunch? Would they still be here? And then we move through that gradually, and eventually check it out and find out it's not true. And then I have people, when they wrote what if, they had gone to another hospital. They hadn't rode their motorcycle that day. I hadn't had an argument. We eventually cross through the what if, and then they write even if they had gone to another hospital, they would have died. Even if I had got there 5 minutes sooner, they would have died. You know, we have big reasons. We want big reasons our loved one died. The world gives us small reasons. It was their time. I mean, who wants that kind of stuff? We want a big reason why our loved one died. I don't just want to hear it was an addiction, it was a mentally compromised mom. I need big reasons. I need something tangible. I need someone to blame, even if it's myself. And here's one of the keys. We would rather be guilty than helpless. We would rather be guilty than helpless. We don't want to live in a world that's random, that someone like our child could be taken and we couldn't have prevented it. We want to think we could have changed it, but most of the time we could not have. Like 99.9% of the time.
That's so beautifully said. Thank you. And I just want to say that Gordine is saying that she loved the restraint you used with your son about deciding when to ask his question. I think that is beautiful as well.
So hard.
Yes, it is hard, especially since we're worrying about these siblings.
We don't want them to be in pain. And yet, you know, look, like I said earlier, my mother died when I was 13. No one could have said anything to process that grief out of me. There's part of that I had to process at 20 and 25 and 30. You couldn't have done anything to like get me out of pain at 13. It just wouldn't have worked.
Well, and this has obviously been something that has shaped your life ever since, and that you have been able to formulate all of those thoughts that you've started forming when you were 13 and use to help so many people throughout your life. And we have just a few minutes. I was wondering if maybe you could just kind of conclude. I know you have your Tender Hearts podcast.
They're on their own tonight with another leader, but they're taken care of.
Good.
By the way, Tender Hearts is closed right now. There's a waiting list. If anyone wants to find that out, they can find it at Tender Hearts. I'll put it in the chat. Tender Hearts Support. And I always say, even though there's a waiting list, if anyone's in extreme pain, just write to me and tell me, and we'll always try to squeeze someone in, especially from your group.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. And so it's all one word, I would assume. Tender
I'm going to put it in.
You're putting it in. Okay.
I'm putting it in because sometimes we put it in with one S and people can't find it. You can also find it at grief.com and find the free group there also.
Well, that's wonderful. And you have so many compliments that are in the chat box right now. It's so wonderful to be able to see that so many people identify with what you're saying. I want to repeat and just let people know that your book is incredibly helpful.
Finding Meaning?
Yes,
There it is.
Finding Meaning, the 6th stage of grief. So if anyone wants to be able to read it, obviously it's on our website. We have it as one of our recommended books, but also it's available in Chinese now. It's available in Spanish and probably in many other languages as well, which is wonderful. Everyone is saying that you have been a lifesaver. Dolores is a lifesaver to me in my early grief and still helps you so much. Joan is saying this has been wonderful. Thank you, David. Let's see, it's a must read. Your book is. Thank you. Such a wonderful gift tonight. Love the book. Thank you for being with us tonight. I found your book after very soon after losing my beautiful son. You shone the light on the dark path ahead of me and gave me hope that I would be able to take each step. Iris is saying, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful and helpful. Rhonda, thank you. Everyone's saying thank you.
Let me just say this, and I also put in another free class I have in there, parentforever.com, for anyone who wants to hear more about my views on a parent who's had a child die. I also just want to mention, I spent decades teaching. And one of the things, my son David, his girlfriend was a social worker. He would show up in my lectures in the back row. And I, for decades, would do this work and would meet parents and so many people who have been through the worst tragedies and would show up at my lectures wanting to learn how to help others. And I'll tell you, in my darkest times with my own son, David, I thought about all of you, and you were my inspiration. And it wasn't a book that got me through it. It was really all of you. So I'm forever grateful to all the parents who had to go through this hardship before me, were really my teachers. So it's profound to me. And I've got a grief educator program coming up soon to teach other people how to do this work, because the world needs it more than ever.
Well, and we do. We need more people like you, David, and like Paul as well. We can't wait to be.
Oh, Paul's going to be great. Paul's
grief yoga
amazing.
with him, and
Paul talks about the issues are in your tissues and how grief gets stuck in our body. And I am not a yoga person, so if you're like, oh, I'm not a yoga person, still show up. He does it from a chair. He'll teach you how to deal with the whys and the anger. He's great.
Well, and we're very excited about it. Thank you so much for spending the time that you did with us this evening. We are truly grateful, and hopefully maybe Ana will be able to have you on her Helping Parents Heal en Español. Her last meeting had 207 people from all over the world. It wasn't just here in the States. Spain, as well as South America. It was really a wonderful meeting.
I'm going to find out when the book comes out in Spanish, because that'd be a good time so that people
would be
do
perfect. That would be wonderful.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much.
Oh, Elisabeth, Irene, everyone, I love you. Dolores, so wonderful seeing you, and Cecilia, and so many other friends. Thank you.
I think that Irene has unmuted everyone.
Yes,
so
please
please
unmute
make
yourself.
sure to
Thank
say thank you and goodbye. And
Thank you, David.
have a wonderful
Thank
evening.
you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you,
Thank you so
David.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you,
Thank
David.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
And thank you, everyone. We'll
Thank
see you
you.
tomorrow
Bye.
See you
night.
tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful
Bye-bye.
evening. Thanks again,
Bye-bye.
David.